Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey everybody, welcome to Team House, episode 206. I'm Dave Park, co-host Jack Murphy, and tonight we are happy to welcome our guest, Gary Noesner. I got that right, correct? Noesner?
You did.
Great. Who wrote the amazing book, Stalling for Time. Gary is a former FBI negotiator. And Gary, like, you've been around, you have seen a lot.
Yeah, I'm an old guy, you know. I was in the FBI for 30 years and spent 23 as a negotiator, and the last 10 as the chief officer's negotiator for the FBI.
So, Gary, let's start out with your origin story. How did you end up at the FBI? What in your life led you to that?
Well, I talk about it in the book. It's really a simple story. When I was real young, 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that, I saw a Mickey Mouse episode. A Mickey Mouse show was a big thing back in the 50s. And so a kid after school would watch that, and they had an episode where the host went to FBI headquarters and interviewed J. Edgar Hoover, and then went down and shot the Thompson machine gun and all that sort of stuff. And I watched that, and something about it just really thrilled me. And my mom came home from work that day, and I said, I've had an epiphany, and I didn't even know what one was. But, I told her I really wanted to be an FBI agent. She bought me a little kid's book about the FBI, and that was it. I never looked back. It's all I ever wanted to do.
That's fantastic. So what was your path then through high school, college? What did you talk to people? Did you figure out what you needed to do to get there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's interesting. In my neighborhood, there, once I was of high school age, in our neighborhood, there was a fellow that worked for the FBI. He was an agent in the Jacksonville office where I was raised, Jacksonville, Florida. And, he was kind enough to encourage me to pursue my dream, even though I had to get through college and all of that stuff. So, I got a teacher's certificate as a backup plan, but my ultimate goal always was to get in the FBI, and it worked out.
So what happened when you first got accepted? Like, what was the academy like back then? What were your initial impressions?
Well, the academy, I mean, the hard part was getting in, and the process and the wait, was pretty significant. When I first joined the FBI, I was too young to be an agent, so I joined as a support employee. And, then there was a big backup for a year on hiring. And so it seemed to drag on for quite a long time. And, I was thrilled when I finally was able to get my appointment to the academy. And, then it's academics, it's physical fitness, it's firearms, all the procedures you go through in law enforcement, collecting evidence, testifying in court, arresting people. I found it all fascinating. It's always what I wanted to do. So, and then my first office of assignment was Columbia, South Carolina, where I arrested fugitives all day long and responded to bank robberies. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I thought it was the greatest job ever. It was like a boy's dream, to do all that interesting and exciting stuff.
Was this still during the J. Edgar years?
Actually, no. He died the summer before I joined the FBI. I joined in October of '72. I think he died in June or July of that year. But I think it would not be unfair to say that he was with the outfit for quite a while in terms of policies, procedures, and certainly ethos and our socialization. It was pretty Hoover oriented for a long time.
And what was that like for you down in South Carolina? Did you work with local law enforcement a lot?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's this, you watch the movies and it's always the the cops are all the smart guys and they do all the work, and the stupid FBI comes in and got our fancy suits, but we don't know what we're doing. And, that's just a bunch of nonsense. I mean, we had great relationships and worked with the police, and particularly back there in the 70s. The police depended upon the FBI for almost all of their training, which the FBI gave at no charge because that was part of our mission. But we worked very cooperatively with local police on any number of situations, and that was one of the elements about the work I enjoyed the most.
Yeah. Were there any cases that were outstanding in your memory of your time in South Carolina?
No, not really. I mean, I think it was just routine stuff. I learned how to be an agent.
Yeah.
How to talk to people, interview people, make a safe arrest, and testify in court, and essentially do those things that an FBI agent needs to learn to do to be successful on the job. And I had some great older agents as mentors that really helped me to learn. And I also had a few older agents that I learned not to do for certain things by watching them. I always used to joke around that there were two older agents I would go arrest fugitives with, and one of them was a big, strong former college football player, and he was certainly capable of being a tough guy, but he knew how to talk to people and would get their cooperation. And another guy I worked with, he just had this ability to piss people off, and we'd end up rolling around the dirt and when we're making our arrests. And, I only had about 3 suits from J.C. Penney or something like that, and I wasn't real keen on ripping them apart, if we're fighting some guy that doesn't want to go to jail. But you learn pretty quick who you want to copy and who you want to learn from, and what skill sets are really helpful to doing your job as productively as you can. And communication is the key, and that ultimately is what led me to the negotiation field.
Yeah. So then after South Carolina, where did you go after that?
Well, I was transferred to the Washington field office, not the headquarters, the Washington field office, and worked foreign counterintelligence for a couple of years, and really wasn't my cup of tea, but you got to work where they send you. And then I got on a terrorism squad, and that proved to be a really interesting assignment, because in 1984, the Congress passed a law that said if you kidnap an American or hold them hostage anywhere in the world, the FBI would investigate it. So here it is, 1985, the early 80s. I'm working terrorism, and all of those cases were worked out of the squad I was on with about 7 or 8 guys. And we were traveling all over the world, responding to hijackings and Kelly Laurel shipjacking, the TW-847 hijacking, Pan Am 73, the Rome and Vienna airport attacks, on and on and on. And that was sort of a heavy dose of international exposure that, most agents didn't experience back in those days. The only people that really traveled abroad were executives going to some conference, or the few legal attaches we had assigned to places like London or Paris. So to have a street agent traveling to Italy, or Germany and conducting investigations was a brand new thing. And it was sort of exciting to be part of that. It certainly took a toll on the family being away so much, but the experience was invaluable.
I would love to ask you, because this is sort of like the birth of counterterrorism. Was the FBI also building a relationship with the United States military during that time because of potential counterterrorism missions abroad?
We did. I worked more as a negotiator than an investigator, but in addition to being an investigator, I was a negotiator part-time before I became a full-time negotiator. And we would periodically run training exercises with the Delta team and with the SEAL teams, counterterrorism exercises, should we have a major event and have to work together, and, how did negotiations support what they were doing, and vice versa. So those were interesting times. And particularly when I look back at them, because my son eventually became a Navy SEAL, and I always thought it was interesting having worked with them, back in the 80s.
Was hostage negotiation, was it a formalized was it sort of a formalized track prior to terrorism? I mean, were they doing it for like local hostage type stuff, or was it something that developed over time?
Yeah, it really started with NYPD, up where you guys are. They started it in, I think, 70, 73, 74, something like that. And they say it was based on the Munich massacre, that they were concerned that something like that would happen in the States. But I think it was also necessity based on a couple major situations they had that just weren't managed very well and didn't go the way they wanted them. So they decided to put this unit together, and Harvey Schlossberg and Frank Boltz put it together and called it hostage negotiations. And it was basically containing a situation and opening a dialogue. The FBI recognized it pretty quickly as being a pretty effective approach. And of course, we stole it, copied it, and then, began to teach it around the United States and overseas. We were able to put a lot more resources to sort of fine tuning the behavioral scientific aspects of it. But we always give credit to New York for having started it. But yeah, it was a new and emerging field, and I'd heard about it, and I wanted to something about it appealed to me. So in 1980, a couple of years after they'd started doing it, I got a chance to go to the hostage negotiation school training at FBI Academy, and it took, it was something that I think I was comfortable doing and was successful at. So those were very exciting years for me. I was particularly in the mid to late 80s, or I was working these terrorism cases like Lockerbie and things like that, and at the same time working with local police departments in Washington, responding to situations and getting some experience and training and responding to FBI situations as well. So it was a great time of learning.
So after your time with the terrorism unit, you said that you were kind of doing negotiation then, but did you move into like a full-time negotiator position after that?
In 1990, I'd been deployed to Lockerbie, Scotland for the terrible tragedy there. And at this point in time, I was the longest running field agent on the terrorism squad. And I'd been doing it for 8 years, and I was kind of burned out. I had 3 young kids at home. I was spending an awful lot of time away. So they kept asking me to put in for a job at Quantico to become one of what was then 3 full-time hostage negotiators. There's 350 negotiators in the FBI or so, but there was only 3 full-time program managers at the time. And because I was, I think I was certainly at a point where I needed to make a change. So I accepted one of those positions. And so then I remember telling my wife I won't be traveling as much. And that was the big lie, because I ended up traveling even more as a negotiator. So why she stuck with me all these years is kind of a mystery.
So even before that, that time being one of the full time, like you were doing this on a regular basis, though.
Well, regular, I'm not sure what you mean by that. It's not like we have a hostage or barricade or suicide situation every day. But yeah, right. I was teaching police officers because as soon as I got out of the training, I became a teacher to pass that knowledge on to police.
Right.
So having been the teacher for the police, when they would have a challenging or interesting situation, they would call me out to come out and play a role in helping them resolve it. And mostly with Metropolitan Police Department in D.C., where I had great friendships and learned a lot, and also I think helped them in some ways as well. So it was a good partnership.
So can you tell us about like your first negotiation, the first time up to bat doing this?
Gosh, my first real, there's a lot of little stuff, but the first real big one I talk about in my book was, what year was that? 82, I think. I flew down to Raleigh, North Carolina. There was a man on a train, a drug runner, who was traveling with his sister and her 2 young children as sort of his cover. Somewhere coming up from Miami in the middle of the night on the train, a dispute erupted, and he ended up shooting and killing her. Obviously, they had a sleeper compartment, and the other compartments obviously heard the gunshots. The train ended up getting disconnected from the rest of the train, and the car did, and was there in Raleigh, North Carolina. Well, the perpetrator only spoke Spanish, so the local police didn't really have a Spanish-speaking negotiator. So one of my mentors at the FBI Academy called me up and said, "You have a Spanish-speaking negotiator on your team in Washington," and I did. A guy named Ray Harris, newly trained. So Ray and I, and along with this fellow from Quantico, Fred Lansley, the three of us flew down to Raleigh to help them resolve that situation. And at the time, it was the longest situation outside of a prison in the history of the United States. It was 72 hours or something like that. But eventually, sadly, a young baby in the compartment died from dehydration. But we got the little girl out alive and eventually surrendered. So that was my first really big siege.
Yeah. What do you remember? Did you have any personal lessons learned from when you did that, or any frustrations?
Oh, sure. There's a ton of lessons. And what happened is the Spanish-speaking negotiator, Ray, he was just fresh out of the training academy. So he was a great agent, a great guy, a super guy, a great friend today. But he had never done any of this before. So in essence, I was coaching him. By coaching, I'm, basically telling him what I thought he should say. And of course, he's trying to turn that into Spanish and deliver that message. And he ended up doing a fantastic job and went forward and rescued the little girl when the guy decided to let her go. And it's all set forth in my book. It was a pretty interesting, challenging case.
Yeah. I just want to ask you real quick, because you said for 6 months you investigated politicians. And I know this is a little of a derailment, but what was that like for you? Was it challenging? Were you enabled to do that?
Yeah, I wasn't there long enough to work any really big time cases. But in addition to terrorism and negotiations, one of the things that always intrigued me was political corruption. Mm-hmm. And I decided, before I went to Quantico and when I got off of that traveling terrorism team, that would be something interesting to work. And so I worked a couple interesting cases. Nothing major or noteworthy that you would know about, but I always felt that one of the really important roles of the FBI was to be sort of a check and balance on political corruption, which we have no shortage of here in the United States. And I'm still proud of the work we do in that regard. Yeah. I should say they do now.
So, I'm going to kind of jump forward in the book a bit, because the book, and I highly recommend, this is a fantastic book reading about, firsthand accounts of being a negotiator and a lot of the challenges that you face when you're dealing with more gung-ho aspects or elements of the law enforcement that you work with.
I should show them the paperback version too, because I don't even think they print the hard book anymore. But this is in 2018 when they came out with the Paramount Waco movie, Random House. My publisher decided to bring this out in paperback and change the cover.
And I should also mention, Gary, that you were in the recent documentary on Netflix, American Apocalypse. And which I really enjoyed hearing from you and some of the other guys. Everybody. We'll get to that, I'm sure, but it was an interesting documentary worth people's time.
Yeah, I think they did a great job on it. I was very much involved in that project from the beginning, and I was very pleased that Tiller Russell, the director, did an incredible job of piecing it all together. And I think there's been, a dozen documentaries on Waco in the last 30 years, and that one, in my opinion, is far and away the most comprehensive, the most accurate. And if people watch one thing about Waco, it should probably be that 3-part documentary on Netflix.
So let's talk about Talladega, because that was a big success for the FBI, right? That was kind of an that you mentioned. The from success to hubris is actually the title of your chapter about that. So can you give us the background on Talladega and how that all started?
Well, the hubris came because of the success at,
Right.
at Talladega. At Talladega, you know, it was a situation where we were dealing with Cuban inmates, and you may recall that back in the 80s, we had two simultaneous prison riots in Atlanta and Oakdale, Louisiana, of Cuban inmates. And what had happened was during the Mariel boat lift, Castro sort of emptied his cells and kicked all these prisoners out, and they came to the United States, and you know, no small number of them engaged in crime once they got here. So they were arrested, prosecuted, thrown in jail, and then when their time was served, they couldn't be extradited back to or removed back to Cuba because Cuba wouldn't take them. And then we couldn't let them out of jail here because they were here illegally. So it was a real conundrum. So that sparked eventually, you know, a not surprising riot when the Cuban inmates felt that they were stuck in limbo in perpetuity. But that was resolved peacefully, those two riots. And then a third outcome was Talladega, you know, some years later. And the reason Talladega occurred, again with Cuban inmates, is those inmates had been at Atlanta and Oakdale and had more or less been given the impression that their problems would be resolved, and they weren't. So here they are some years later, and they're still stuck in a federal prison with no hope of getting out. So they ended up taking hostages, correctional officers, and some Immigration and Naturalization Service personnel. And it was a tough negotiations, lasted over 8 days because we couldn't really say, hey, we'll work it out, because that's the line we gave them years before, and it didn't happen. I mean, we didn't have much credibility with them in terms of trying to resolve what was essentially almost an unresolvable problem. We can't let murderers out on the street here and, you know, armed robbers and so forth, and Castro wouldn't take them back. So Talladega essentially began to unravel, and during the negotiations, we were able to get one hostage out after some considerable work, and that hostage told us that they were going to, they'd already picked names out of a hat, and they were going to start executing hostages. So that was really very insightful inside information, which prompted us to say, we're going to have to take some action to try to conduct a rescue. And so that's what happened. So the negotiators then went into our support the tactical folks phase, and we provided a very rich meal to the inmates who hadn't eaten for 8 days. And, you know, they stuffed themselves and began to feel as though they now had turned the tide and they had all the power and control. And as they slumbered off to sleep, the hostage rescue team entered the entered the cell block and rescued all the hostages and arrested all the inmates without firing a shot. So it was a great success for the FBI. And but as you mentioned, the hubris part was that the head of the hostage rescue team, I think, came away from that thinking a certain level of invincibility that showed its ugly side in Ruby Ridge and Waco some years later.
Yeah, you also mentioned that it sort of came away with the negotiation team appearing subservient to, or you know, that they were a lower priority, or that they were just a supporting aspect to the assaulters.
You know, there's an age-old, it's as old as the negotiation business, where we're paramilitary organizations in law enforcement, and so there is a natural tendency to use force to compel somebody to do something when they resist or they don't do what we want. And it can actually drive decision making in a very negative way and cost police officers their lives. The whole reason negotiations was developed was not just because we were concerned about saving some victim. It was really to prevent law enforcement officers from having to enter a dangerous situation where they may be killed or seriously injured. So every time we succeed as a negotiator, which, by the way, is in the mid 90 percentile, which is like nothing else in law enforcement is even remotely close to that statistically. But when we succeed, we keep officers, you know, safe, and they can go home at night. So the default, you know, if you listen to all the the philosophical conversations from law enforcement, we always say we don't use any more force than is absolutely necessary. And so that would suggest that negotiations comes first, and only if that is not working or the threat increases based on the actions and behavior of the perpetrator, then we consider tactical intervention. But as a practical matter, there are those in law enforcement that don't quite understand the negotiation process. It's sort of a gray, fuzzy thing, and they live in a black and white world, and so it's like they're not doing what we say. Let's go get them. They don't stop to think very often about the potential harm to themselves, or if they kill a hostage by mistake, or whatever it might be. So I always feel negotiation should be the default, always for law enforcement, and only if we can articulate that our failure to act will likely result in loss of life, of hostage, victim, whatever, then we give serious consideration to going in. But we don't do it just because we're tired or we're upset that this guy's not paying attention to us. That certainly factors into some decision making, but it shouldn't. It should be a decision that, and a negotiator like me shouldn't be saying, oh, it's going fine, boss, or it's going bad. I should have to articulate very clearly, these particular indicators would suggest to me that we are engaged in having a fairly workable relationship with this person. Their language is less violent, their actions are less concerning, and stay the course. It may take some time yet, but there's no reason to rush in and do anything that might jeopardize life. And conversely, as in Talladega, if a negotiator like me says, hey, this thing is unraveling, and as much as we would like to succeed, it's quite likely that if we don't act, these people are going to become violent. That doesn't mean negotiations failed. It just means that the perpetrators failed to behave the right way or think the right way. My judgment, negotiations never fails because we always buy time. I mean, as you guys would probably know, from any time you respond to a crisis, what we know in the first hour versus, say, the 6th or 7th hour is vastly different. So what do we do as negotiators? We're verbally containing the situation, not just physically. We're verbally containing it. We're gathering information about the perpetrator. What's their mental health background? What's their criminal history? We talk to friends, relatives, and coworkers. How impulsive are they? How dangerous? How do they handle stress? And all of these things help us to deal more effectively with a person. But while we're doing that, it allows the tactical team to practice, to rehearse, to assemble equipment. So there's so many factors for buying time. And, again, that's the name of my book, Stalling for Time. And that's why I named it that, because the only time works against you is if you've got some hostage or police officer bleeding to death and you got to get to them. Those are extraordinarily rare. But in almost all cases, if we slow it down, we lower the emotional content. And that's the point in time which people begin to think and behave more rationally.
It's and apparently you guys have a lot of your own types of weapons to bring to bear, because one of the things you mentioned in the Talladega section was aromatic warfare, which I thought was really great.
I actually stole that from Frank Boltz in New York City. I remember when I first met Frank, he was telling me a story about some guy was held up in an apartment building and he hadn't had any food for a while, or breakfast or whatever it was. So they fried some bacon down the hall and kind of stimulated his gastro response. So I had this idea at Talladega. I said, the inmates had not eaten for quite a while, so let's bring out some big barbecue grills, because we had guys literally, they didn't have handguns or firearms, so we could stand out where they could see us. So the guards surrounding this cell block, we brought these big portable barbecue grills out and let them cook some steaks, and and the wind was sort of carrying the aroma of that into the cell block, and that's a strong motivation when you haven't eaten for quite a few days. And we did it nonchalantly. We didn't do it in such an obvious, in-your-face way, but I think the message helped.
Yeah. So the hubris from this chapter, because you move on from Talladega to Ruby Ridge, can you give us the background of Ruby Ridge and how that all started?
Well, let me say what since the the mid 70s, the FBI has always taught that negotiations is our preferred method of resolution. And again, as I mentioned earlier, only tactics only come if warranted, and we have no other recourse. And that's usually decided by the behavior of the perpetrator. And more want to live than die. So that's why we're as successful as we are. What happened because of that very dynamic and laudable rescue work that the hostage rescue team did at Talladega, their new commander at the time kind of felt as though that he was the beginning and end of all of how to do all of this. And it was one problem that he thought that way, but he also, I think, high-level FBI officials believed it as well. So when we get to Ruby Ridge, and I wasn't there, my partner was, but we start off with there's a shootout between the Marshals and the Weaver family, and Weaver's son is killed, the Marshals killed. So as my partner and the hostage rescue team chief are flying out there, he basically says there's no negotiations involved in this, and basically orders his snipers, if you see anybody with anybody with a weapon, you can shoot him. Well, there's a little thing we have called the Constitution that requires a bit more than that. I mean, you can only use deadly force if your life or another is in imminent threat, imminent danger. So it was sort of a violation of that, and that's what happened. They shot wounded Weaver and a friend of his, and another bullet was fired and went through the front door and ended up unintentionally killing Vicki Weaver as she was holding one of their children. Well, that situation turned from bad to worse real quick. But I will note, and I'm not saying this because I was there, because I wasn't, but it still was negotiated out after about 8 days, and despite all that loss of life. But we move on to 6 months later. That was the fall of '92. In the spring of '93, we have Waco, and we still have this same person in charge of the hostage rescue team, and again, the same aggressive approach to, hey, we're going to force these people out. You tried talking to them for a couple of days, Mr. Negotiator, but they're not listening. So we're going to increase the external pressure and make them come out. Well, as a negotiator, I call that the paradox of power. And that is, the harder you push, the more likely you get resistance. And that's exactly what happened. So we had success as negotiators at Waco. We got 35 people out, including 21 children, during the first half of the ordeal. I was there 26 out of the 51 days. But the problem is, every time we were making successful headway, the tactical team would move forward in some aggressive action that would undercut the negotiation message. You're going to pay attention to the nice man on the phone talking to you, or the guy in the tank that just crushed your car. I mean, which one's going to have a bigger impact on you? So that's when I said we, went from that success at Talladega to sort of a hubris, a feeling that, hey, we've got this tremendous tactical resource. We can use it and make people do what we want. And that was a fatal mistake there. And the FBI certainly shifted back to the way we were after Waco, realizing that the negotiation team that I led had it right, and we should have stayed the course with that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Ruby Ridge real quick, because you mentioned, given the countervailing charge of the government misconduct, Randy Weaver was acquitted on all counts except failure to appear, and then both him and his daughters won damages awards.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, I think the government's actions were seen as so egregious that paid a price for that, and of course Weaver paid the ultimate price. I ended up meeting Randy Weaver in '96 when he uninvitedly came out to Montana to try to get involved in our negotiations with the Freemen. So I had an opportunity to meet him for the first time there and talk with him, and that was an interesting experience.
Was he basically, because Bo Gritz had sort of injected himself into your negotiations, that he thought maybe he could do the same?
Well, he was with Bo. He came
Okay.
out with Bo. Bo bought him out, and they approached us and they said, "Hey, we want to talk to these guys." And I was tasked by FBI leaders to sit down and talk to them both and determine whether or not we should consider using them. And, I liked the message they were pretending. I mean, Bo was, either trying to, Bo was is an interesting character, very outgoing and brash, but I liked his message. He said he would try to convince them to come out. And Randy Weaver, I asked him, I said, Randy, why do you want to go in? And he said, I want to tell them not to make the same mistake I did. He said, if I had just come out, my family would be alive here today. And I thought it was a pretty compelling argument. And I made that argument to FBI leaders, but it's probably the only recommendation that wasn't accepted. They let Bo go in, but they didn't let Randy Weaver go in. I guess there was too much bad blood between Department of Justice and the FBI and the Weavers after Ruby Ridge. But the Freeman didn't want to see Bo either, but he sort of convinced him to go inside there, and he didn't get along with him too well, but it was an effort worth trying.
Yeah. I hope you don't mind. We've talked about the documentary on Waco and everything, but you cover a lot of things in your book that I think, haven't really been talked about a whole lot before or by people who had firsthand accounts. And while we don't expect you to remember every single detail of the book you wrote, because we know how that is, I would really like to go through some of the events as they happened, because it really shows sort of not just sort of the challenges you were having with David Koresh himself, making a lot of false promises, but also the challenges that you were having with your own internal, like with the FBI, David Rogers and Jamar, like with some of the people on the ground. I think even from your flight out to Waco, right? Can you tell us about what happens when you get called out and you guys get on your...
Yeah, I mean, it's April 19th, the day of the it's February 28th, 93, the day of the ATF raid. And of course, the shootout that followed. And we had beepers then, and not even cell phones. And my beeper went off, and I went to a phone booth. I was out running errands with my family. It was a weekend. I think it was a Sunday, and I called my boss, and he gave me a thumbnail sketch of what was going on. He said, get to the airport where we keep our planes. So I took my family home and grabbed my go bag, and off I went. And when I got to the airport, there's two planes there. There's an executive jet, and there's a prop plane. And I get put in a prop plane, and they put the head of HRT in the jet. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what's he going to do? Assault the compound by himself before his team gets there? Wouldn't you want the negotiator there right away to start talking to this guy? But that's the thinking, this is the guy. We got to get the guy out here. So it was just sort of a metaphor for sort of a power struggle that took place once we got out there.
And so you get out there, and Jeff Jamar is the FBI on-scene commander, and then it's David Rogers, right, who was running her at the time?
Dick Rogers. Dick Rogers.
Yeah. So what were you used to, or what did you recommend in terms of like talking to those two, the leader of HRT and the on-scene commander, and then what did they decide was going to be the way of you guys disseminating information?
Well, the first couple days, I mean, they were certainly supportive, and they're both guys that made decisions I didn't agree with, but their intent was proper. Nobody in the FBI team wanted to see anybody get hurt and wanted everybody to come out alive. But their frustration levels really built up after, I think it was the third day, we'd gotten some kids out, quite a few kids, and David Koresh said he would surrender and bring everybody out alive if we played a national radio broadcast that he'd taped. We listened to the tape. We didn't see anything problematic in it. We played it to religious scholars at Baylor, and it was worth the effort. And I told the bosses, let's give this a try. We may be able to resolve this. And we played it nationwide on the Christian Broadcast Network, and Koresh heard it. And in the tape, we made him include a preamble saying that, once this was broadcast nationally, he and his followers would come out peacefully. So that's what we did. And then, we have all the buses lined up. We have all the provisions lined up to accept these people coming out of the building. And at the last minute, Koresh, hears from God that, he shouldn't go. Kind of a convenient sort of divine, intervention, I suppose. And it disappointed me as a negotiator.
Right.
Did it surprise me? No. We're kind of used to having people make representations and then not, at least initially, following through on it. So when that happens, the preferred method is to go back to them repeatedly and say, hey, David, I went out on a limb for you. I had this thing played. I did everything you wanted. I'm working for you here to get you out. And, you're making me look bad with my boss. I'm trying to help you. You got to help me help you. That would have been the approach we had planned to take. But, self-control is something I teach as a negotiator. And that's what we had to exercise. I will say that others in the decision-making tree reacted to that failure to come out and took it almost personally and got extremely angry and said, well, we're going to show him. He's jacking us around. So they went forward with the tanks and, did what they did. And of course, then Koresh responds that, hey, you promised you'd stay off our land, which a promise had been made to bring about the ceasefire with ATF after the initial shootout. So now, instead of having some moral high ground relative to Koresh, where we're saying we did what you did, you're not doing your thing. Now he's saying, look what you're doing. You're trying to force us out. You're being overly aggressive. And he had a valid argument. And so it was a case of, I think, the on-scene commander not appreciating the inconsistencies. He would generally approve of my strategies, but then he would go to the forward command post and talk to the tactical team leader, and he would hear a very contradictory approach, and he would say, yeah, that sounds good too. I don't think ever fully appreciating that the two were inconsistent and contradictory.
Right. And, for people who might not be aware of the history, the ATF tried an 80-man raid on the compound. And we've talked to people in the past who said he probably could have been picked up out on town,
Well, that's one of the criticisms that you hear, that, instead of a dynamic entry, they probably could have, patiently waited for Koresh to leave the property, which he reportedly did periodically, and arrest him. I think that's the way we would have done it. 3 years later, when we did the Montana Freeman siege, that's what we did. We lured the two leaders out and arrested them. We countered different set of problems, but I'm convinced that had Koresh been arrested early on, it's all over. It's done. He was the absolute, unquestionable leader. I mean, he controlled every aspect of everyone's life, and if he'd been out of the picture, I'm sure we'd have gotten everybody out in short order.
Yeah. And then you guys went to a great length to separate yourselves from the ATF in the beginning too.
I did, yeah. I mean, and the first night I was there, one of the ATF negotiators was kind of worn out. He was talking to them, and Jim Cavanaugh, he'd been doing a great job. He said, I'm about to fall on my face. He said, will you take over talking to him? And it's really the only time I negotiated directly, because at this point in my career, I'm the head negotiator. I'm not the guy on the phone. I'm running the whole team. But my other negotiators weren't out there yet. So even in my propeller plane, I got out there way ahead of everybody else. So I got on the phone with Koresh for, I don't know, 10 hours or so. And it was an interesting chat for sure. And, we were able to try to continue the good work that Jim had done. And he released some more people some more kids the next day. I'm sorry, I don't think I hit your question.
No, that's fine. It's just because it was the ATF that had, done the entry.
I'm sorry. Thank you. What I was starting to tell you was that when I took over, there were 5 or 6 ATF agents or more in the room. And these were guys who'd been part of the raid. I mean, they were just the walking wounded. And I said, listen, guys, when I get on the phone, don't get the wrong impression, but I'm going to make sure I distance myself from what you did. Not because I disapprove of or approve. I'm neutral on the subject. I'm just trying to make him say, hey, we're a different team now coming in. You can deal with us because you've obviously got bad blood. You can point fingers at each other who shot first, but I don't really give a shit. I've got to get these people out. So I said, if you're not comfortable with that, then you should leave the room. And that's what I did. I say, we're not the ATF. This is the FBI. We're in here now investigating this. And I think that was the right approach to take, and would do it again.
And, during this time, you said that, you would do these negotiations, and then sometimes like the FBI leadership would do something that was contrary to what you'd been negotiating. How did that sort of undermine your effort, considering that Dave Koresh and a lot of these, same as like the Weavers, where they saw, the government as a force of the apocalypse. And then when agents are swarming all over their house, it's like, see, this is exactly what we said it was going to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, David Koresh taught an apocalyptic philosophy, and the key element of that was the forces of evil, the forces of Babylon were going to come against them at some point, and they were all going to die and rise up again and all that sort of thing. Kind of Book of Revelations sort of end times philosophy. And so, yeah, when ATF conducted its raid, I mean, if it did anything, it enhanced Koresh's status as a prophet. He's saying, hey, I told you they were coming for us. And lo and behold, here they were. So we start off in a hole with that.
That's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely. And then every time we as negotiators would get some positive interaction going and we'd get somebody to come out, the frustration by the tactical team to turn off the power or run over a car or do something provocative, it just dug us in a hole that we had to dig out of again. And this went up and down for days. And it got near the end of my time there, on March 22nd, I'll never forget it. We had 7 adults come out. 7. The biggest release in the whole siege. And Steve Snyder, Koresh's assistant, the guy we were dealing with at the time, talking with a good bit, he said, I got more people lined up tomorrow. Well, as soon as that 7th person came out, without any consultation, without asking me or anybody in the negotiation team, I mean, they went forward with tanks and knocked shit over. And I mean, I've trained negotiations for 40 years now, and people just don't believe that something so uncoordinated could happen, but it did. And it's just not the way we teach it in the FBI. The on-scene commander, the tactical commander, and the negotiation commander need to be in lockstep. We need to be singing from the same sheet of music and totally coordinating our activities. And that just didn't happen. And I tell people, people say, well, I guess the FBI learned so much at Waco and things you'd never done before. I said, we knew what to do and we were being successful at it. What really marks Waco is a departure from long-standing FBI philosophy and approach. Now, it's hard to explain how could that happen. Well, we had a weak director in the FBI back at headquarters, Sessions, and, there was just poor management at the upper levels of the FBI that let this proceed as it did. I mean, stuff like playing the loud music that everybody criticizes negotiators for. Well, we didn't do that, and we were definitely opposed to it. I mean, it was just, we don't teach it, and we advise against it. It's deprivation agitation techniques. They don't work, and they're ineffective, and they're relationship killers. Yet that was done, without us being asked and without our input. And it took me 3 days to get it stopped, and only then I had to take a back channel approach to FBI headquarters and say, would you tell the idiot down here to quit doing that shit? It makes us look foolish and it's counterproductive. But it's amazing that I had to do that, instead of just saying, boss, don't do this. But that didn't work. So,
yeah, I would like to name that person since they're named in your book. But your description of him, he was especially in charge out of El Paso, Dick Schwein or Schwinn. Yeah, Schwein.
Schwein.
He shows up wearing a dark blue SWAT type uniform when all the other SACs are in like, civilian attire, complete with a web belt holding a canteen.
Yeah. I mean, and his hat was slightly, I mean, it's like, are you trying to win the look goofy competition today or what? The other SACs had golf shirts and chinos on. I mean, they're casual and professional, and this guy comes in like he's in the Looney Tunes, and it was shameful, the stuff that he did. I mean, he's just, from day one he got there, said, we're going to go get those people. We'll tell them, we'll show them who's boss. And it's losing, I always talk about that. Number one attribute of a negotiator or any decision maker is self-control. If you can't control your own emotions and make decisions based on logic and not emotion, how do you expect to control anybody else? You can't. And it's basic philosophy. And, the other thing I remember telling Mr. Jamar was, when the 7 people came out, I said, we're not going to get anybody else out now. I said, have you heard of a guy named Pavlov? When the dog does what we want, we feed the dog, we reward the dog. When these people let people out, we encourage and positively do things for them. We don't kick them in the butt. If you teach your dog to bring you the paper and after a couple times he does it, then you kick him in the nuts, your dog's going to say, no, much, not doing that again. And that's what we did. And I hate to be crude about it, but it's just that simple.
Yeah. And so Schneider, who is like Koresh's number 2 guy working on the inside, who'd been trying to get people out, he'd been trying to work with you guys. Once the floodlights on the compound and the auditory, the sound start playing, like, what was his response to that?
Well, it was a bit embarrassing if you listen to the original tapes from the recordings from the negotiation, which were evidence, and they're, I think, out public access now. He's basically saying stuff like, what am I supposed to believe from my government? You're playing Nancy Sinatra music and the Dalai Lama. What is my government trying to tell me?
Right.
And as negotiators, we're mortified because we don't have a good answer for that.
Right.
There's nothing we can say to justify that. And we just, the only thing we could say is those people don't know you like we do. They're not talking to you like we are. And we can't control. Well, that undercut us because basically Koresh and Snyder are saying, well, if you guys can't control what's going on out there, why should we even talk to you? So it was a terrible, terrible recipe for managing a situation.
Yeah. So is it about this time when your tour is up on this?
Well, we have a rotation system for crisis management where personnel generally spend 3 weeks there. The hostage rescue team should have been relieved as well, but they weren't. You put a bunch of thoroughbred horses, they want to do something. We could have used normal SWAT teams. We didn't need our elite, in my opinion, counterterrorism team there. But anyway, everyone rotates out about 3 weeks. I'd been in my 4th week now. And I think they use that as an excuse to say, hey, Gary, we're going to bring somebody else out. I learned the real reason was I was too much of an impediment to some of the aggressive tactical action they wanted to take. And so they wanted to get me out of there. And sure enough, no one else came out after I left.
Yeah. Yeah, because just prior to that, the SAC Jamar, he said we needed to punish Koresh for not moving fast enough. And that was how they were. Koresh was embarrassing them. And
there was a lot of in their, to some extent, their defense. Certainly Jamar's is. I mean, this is the biggest thing in the news, worldwide. Massive press corps there, massive pressure. The FBI spending $1 million a day or whatever it was in $1993, and and a lot of people in the FBI have always taken pride in our ability to effectively manage situations. And all of a sudden, I think there's a lot of people say, this guy's making us look bad. We're looking inept and ineffectual, and why can't we get this resolved? And those kinds of thoughts lead to action imperative, and the action imperative is, doing something, anything, just to be seen to be doing something, when oftentimes doing nothing is the best course of action.
Yeah. And so they sent out a gentleman named Clint Van Sant. Is that right?
He replaced me, yes.
Yes. And can you tell us about the reservations you had about him?
Well, I don't want to go into too much, but he's a very devout, born again Christian guy, and I think I was concerned, knowing that, having worked with him, that he would try to out divinity Trump. I mean Trump, excuse me, out divinity Koresh. That was a Freudian slip. Anyway, that he would try to convince Koresh, that his interpretation of the seven seals was faulty. And I thought that was a fool's errand, because, you can't really talk somebody out of their core belief systems. And when we got people out, it was not when we talked about religion. It was when we kept him in the here and now. So my boss came out with him to relieve me, and we sat down together and promised they wouldn't do that. And sure enough, a couple of days later, that's spent all night doing it for multiple nights and got nowhere with it.
And it was shortly after this period of time, I think, that the siege ended, or that Waco ended. Can you,
no, I left halfway through. It didn't end for another 25 days or something like that.
And
but you could say, negotiations ended when those 7 people came out, and we responded in a completely inappropriate way.
Right. So you left halfway through, but no more people came out. No more children were sent out. That was
Nothing.
it.
Nothing.
And up until that point, how many people had come out of the compound?
35, 21 kids, and the rest adults.
And how many people were left in the compound?
I think 77 died the last day. I don't have the exact number off the tip of my tongue. There were 9 that survived the fire on the final day, and there is speculation that the reason they survived is they were the fire starters. Maybe not all of them, but a good many of them were, because it didn't come out in the trial or anything, but they had accelerant on their clothing. In other words, they had the fuel oil or the diesel fuel, whatever it was they used to light the fires, on their clothing, and that's the reason they were not clustered in the middle, where they would have perished with so many of the others so tragically.
I thought one of the interesting things in the documentary, and I had never studied Waco closely, so I kind of just hear things, right, like many people have. One of the impressions that I was under, or that I had heard, was that a fire began in the compound because law enforcement was firing tear gas into it, and the canisters had set it on fire. But in the documentary, it makes the point that was the day prior to the fire. So then it was the next day, and you had the fires break out, and some of them you had one fire, and then 2 more broke out that were upwind of the original fire. And I mean, all of this was very interesting to learn in the documentary.
Well, a little backed up on that. I mean, the tear gas went in the final morning.
Okay.
It was pumped in, and there were also ferret rounds popped in with, shotgun shells with tear gas in them. Those can be flammable, and it's convenient for people to say, "Oh, the FBI started the fire." But the arson investigation made it pretty conclusive that the Davidians started the fire. The fire originated simultaneously in 3 places. There were hidden microphones that we had sent in with various deliveries of milk and whatnot, and those were not contemporaneously. You had to filter those and listen to them later. But after the fact, we heard, they're saying, "Light the fires, start the fires." One of the surviving Davidians was put in front of one of the 9 was put in front of the grand jury the following day, and he said, "I didn't see anybody start the fires, but I heard them saying, 'Start the fires.'" So, and then we have an observation of one of the hostage rescue team guys, because the walls had been partially torn down, saw a guy starting fires. So all of these together, and the survivors continued to deny it. I think the evidence is overwhelming and conclusive that they started the fire. Now, clearly they started the fire in reaction to our effort to end the thing through the insertion of tear gas, but the tear gas did not mistakenly light up the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sure you can find plenty amongst those survivors that would dispute that claim, but I think the evidence is overwhelming.
Were there, so once this happens, I know that you said that you called the negotiators personally to make sure they understood that they did the best they could, things like that. Like, what were the ramifications? Because this was a big hit for the FBI. What were the ramifications you saw? What did you see agency-wide?
Well, I think that close to it, it took a while for that all to settle down. But immediately, I'm the head of the FBI negotiation program at the time, and I felt these guys and gals are on my team. I'm going to call each and every one of them, tell them how proud I was of them, and that they did their best. They saved 35 people, and I just think that's what a leader should do. And so I did that, and I'm still very proud of that team. While the incident was tragic, that team really was quite effective, and many innovative things we put in place in Waco that have become standard practice throughout the negotiation profession now. Getting to the larger thing, there was obviously after action reports, there was investigations. I can sum it up for you that the FBI basically said that we should have stuck with what the negotiators were saying. That was the bottom line finding. So afterwards, the on-scene commander and the tactical team leader were sort of encouraged to retire, which they did sometime after, and I was given a promotion. We enhanced the power of the hostage negotiation team, the crisis negotiation unit, to be at the same level. At the time of Waco, the HRT commander was like a colonel in the Army, and I was like a lieutenant colonel, and the on-scene commander is like a general. So, but after Waco, they elevated me to be in parity with the head of the HRT so that my voice would have equal weight. That's how it was supposed to work in theory. And we embarked, I was selected to, along with another guy, to train essentially every leader in the FBI about the mistakes that were made and what not to do in the future. So while the FBI vigorously defended itself against external critics, it nonetheless internally knew damn well that we had not done what we always taught. We had not followed our own principles and our own procedures. And, it boils down to this. People ask me who's responsible. I say, well, it's a complex story. I ultimately hold David Koresh responsible because
Sure.
Each and every day we encouraged him to bring his people out peacefully. We made all sorts of concessions and arrangements to make him comfortable with doing that. And yet at the end of the day, he chose not to do that. But because that responsibility is so squarely on his shoulders, a very malignant, narcissistic, self-serving leader, it does not mean that the FBI didn't also make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important thing. I think the public, I've been dealing with this a long time. People want it to be black or white. They were all crazy people and they deserve what they got, or big old bad government shows up and says, let's kill all these people. And that's just ignorant and naive and unsupported by the facts. It's a complex, tragic story. The people inside were mostly good people who unfortunately hitched their wagon to a megalomaniac who abused them in every way. And in the FBI, we had mostly really good people there, essentially all good people trying to do the right thing, but some leaders who, for lack of training or experience, made some really bad decisions that tended to thwart our success as negotiators.
Gary, I'd like to ask you a question, like beyond the tactical questions. This is almost something more philosophical, I think, that Ruby Ridge and Waco still occupy a place in American culture and the American consciousness to this day. And I know if I went and spoke to those surviving 9 members of the Branch Davidians, if I were to sit down with Randy Weaver, they would have a perspective. But I'd like to ask your perspective about where does Waco fit in American consciousness and American culture How does that resonate to this day? I mean, in 2023, it's not just you and I who are still, and Dave, who are still talking about this. I mean, this is something that still exists as something that is contentious and for some people an open wound.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, or a topic. In 2018, Paramount came out with a Waco dramatic 6-part series about Waco, and it was pretty good. Some fictionalization in it, but actor Michael Shannon played me. Well, they just came out with the second season, and it's on Showtime, Paramount right now, and it's called Waco: The Aftermath. And it's about what happened after Waco, and part of that focus is how the events at Ruby Ridge and Waco particularly, really became a rallying cry for anti-government sentiment, which I think leads to your question, and it continues today. But then I recently heard a quote from Sheriff Jack Harwell, who was out in McLennan County and in Waco and would spend a lot of time in our negotiation room, and a lovely man. And he said once, I don't think, and I'm probably not directly quoting him, but he said, I don't think Waco's so much a rallying cry for the right. It's more an excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think, we had, long before Waco, we had the CSA siege, and we had issues with some extreme right-wing anti-government folks. So it's not, they just popped up overnight after Waco. So they were around. I just think this became sort of an excuse for them to do some of the things they did, and continue to do to this day. We 3 years later, we had an 85-day siege in Montana with Freeman, another anti-government group. And this time, unlike Waco, we had a new director, Louis Free, and he basically is on the phone with me and the other leaders out there, and he says, "Hey, Gary, I'm in no rush for this to end. I want this done the right way." And it showed there was a paradigm shift. Now we had gotten back to where we were before Waco. And sure enough, it took us 85 days, but no shots were fired, and everybody surrendered, and no fire, no drama. And of course, nobody knows about it because it fell off the news media. But that's fine. That's the way we want it. But it was probably one of the things I'm most proud of, because it was a reassertion of what we had always believed for 20 years in the FBI, and it's what we'd always taught, and what we'd shared with law enforcement from around the world. And we were finally able to show that despite the tragedy of Waco, we knew how to do these things, and we knew how to do them safely and efficiently. And so I was very proud of my team out there.
Yeah. Outside of Schwein, who, sounds like he kind of was LARPing, playing make-believe, do you feel as though people like Jamar and Rogers, do you feel that they were under pressure from higher ups to get this solved because there were dead ATF agents and it was consuming so much national media space?
I think Jeff Jamar, who, I always hate talking about him because I know in his mind, in his heart, he was trying to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. He just had not been well trained for it. In the FBI, because you're a general, and you have this territory under you, there's an assumption that you know how to do all these things. Well, he can run a great office and get great crime statistics and do any number of things extraordinarily well that the FBI does on a routine basis. But who works a case like this when you get the experience to manage something of this magnitude? Well, the fact of the matter is he didn't, and not he alone, but many didn't. So, this is what I did for full time for my living. So I had some sense of doing these things, but not necessarily the big decision maker. So, but he was trying his best, and I think he was under a lot of pressure. Now, Dick Rogers, I think, just had a different philosophical approach. Some people say, well, the problem was that the tactical people, HRT, and the negotiators weren't talking. Well, that's not true. We had a HRT guy in the negotiation room 24/7. Mm-hmm. We were exchanging information. The problem was we had a deep-seated, fundamental disagreement on the way to deal with these people. Mm-hmm. We wanted to talk them out, knowing that the harder we pushed, the more likely we'd get resistance. And he felt the way to resolve it was to tighten the noose, apply ever-increasing amounts of pressure, and make them do what we wanted, which we know, it's the king in the castle. We've seen it in law enforcement. There are people that'll defend to the death some ramshackle shack they live in because it's their place. And if the police are trying to come in, they'll fight to the death to defend it. Where most of us wouldn't even look at a place like that. But so that's the key. You attack people in their home, and you've got to. The first thought is not, oh, they're getting really serious here, let's go surrender. It's to resist.
Yeah.
I used to tell classes, imagine yourself, you're holed up in your home and, you're holding someone hostage, whatever it might be. And I'm negotiating with you and I say, hey, Jack, Dave, come on out, please. And you say no. And then I send a tank forward and I crush your brand new car in the driveway. I said, how about now? We friends now? I mean,
Yeah, it doesn't work like that.
That's essentially what we did.
Yeah.
It's not a way to build trust, to demonstrate, hey, we're decent people. We're trying to help you out of this situation here. And, you do that kind of crap and it's self-defeating.
Do you have in your mind, because like we had Danny Colson on for a couple episodes, and when he was bringing the HRT up, like even in his book, like some of their early missions were with these sort of white nationalist sort of Christian, they were protracted sieges that ended up well, and it was like, we're not the military, our job is not to conduct military operations. Do you know when that sort of shifted from like the early 80s into the 90s?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Danny's quite right. He was out there for the I forget the year, the cross, the sword, and the arm of the Lord.
Yeah.
And that was resolved. And I worked with Danny from the day he was appointed HRT commander when it was formed out of the Washington field office where I worked. So I was the chief negotiator there. So I worked with him quite closely. We didn't always agree on issues, but we got along pretty darn well. And I have respect for Danny. But I think that's why going back, Dave, to that chapter where you mentioned from to hubris, success to hubris. I think that's what triggered Ruby Ridge and Waco. I think Talladega, the success that it was, left the HRT commander with the belief that he had all the answers and knew how to do this. And, speed and force was the way to resolve these things. And he had the personnel and the equipment to do it. And I think that's what led to that circumstance, because it's the only time it happened, those two cases. And we moved away from that pretty quickly.
Yeah. And so do you think it was something that was kind of throughout HRT, or do you think it was mostly just sort of Sergeant Severe, as you called him, who sort of had that mentality?
I mean, I think there's a mix. I think there were a lot of guys on the hostage rescue team. I mean, they're thoroughbreds. I mean, these are really quite amazing guys, and they're very fit, and they're trained to do this very dangerous job. And it's not surprising that they want to do it, and feel confident in their capabilities to do it. So I think part of the problem was that those guys who were actually out in the trenches really had no idea what we were doing or trying to do as negotiators. And I asked at one point in time, Dick Rogers, hey, can I brief your team at the shifts, the 12-hour shifts? And he said, no, they're getting everything they need from me, which is obvious they weren't. But, 3 years later in Montana, that's exactly what we did. Every tactical team shift during the day, I or one of my negotiators would go out and say, here, guys, here's what we're working on today. Here's the intermediaries we're sending in. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And, you can't treat an FBI agent like some 20-year-old in the military that, you say, go guard that fence line behind that tree, and that's what they do all day long. Agents need information and knowledge and understanding. These are highly educated professional guys. So armed with a better understanding of what we were doing and why, they became completely supportive. And it changed the whole tenor of that siege as compared to 3 years earlier at Waco.
That's fascinating. And it's funny because HRT is hostage rescue. And when you think of hostages, you think of negotiators. So it's weird. It's weird that like you guys aren't tied at the hip in general?
Well, what happened when the team was formed, and there was a budget, there were 60 guys or something like that. And I think one of the things that Danny Colson, when he set up the team, he needed every one of those people for tactical purposes. And he said to me, well, you'll be my negotiator if we deploy. I don't think Danny fully understood then what negotiators did and how we were, how we could support tactics as well if we weren't successful doing what we were doing. But I think you're right. I think in the initial stages, they should have incorporated negotiations to have it all under one roof. And in essence, that's how the FBI has it now with the creation of the Critical Incident Response Group that came post Waco. So now those units are under the same command, and they train together and have a little bit better relationship than when I was there.
It's great that it has evolved to that point.
Yeah, but it should have been. It's hard. But, this goes on in every tactical team. There's thousands of police departments in the United States, and it's still a frequent thing that I hear is that, the tactical teams get all the money, they get all the budget, they get all the training time, they get all the equipment, and they don't really understand or undervalue negotiators. So the negotiators always feel like the weak stepsister or whatever it is. And but other departments have recognized that these units have to work extraordinarily close if they're going to be effective.
Yeah.
And again, I in law enforcement, and this has become very topical in the last few years as police use of force has come into question. We serve the public. We have to be able to convey to the public that we're well trained, we're professional, and that we use force not because we want to, not because we can. We use force only under one condition: when the behavior of the perpetrator leaves us no alternative, and when the public can clearly see, through videotape or testimony, whatever it is, court of law, court of a public opinion, that this person, left us with no choice other than to use deadly force, they'll support us. But if we can't make that case, if it comes out that we took this action because we're cold, we're wet, we're tired, we're angry at this person, then we lose public confidence. And law enforcement agencies can't afford to lose that support.
So, you have a few other, you have the Freemans, and you have the Ohio Correctional Facility. Like there are several more stories in this book. Can you kind of hit on some? I don't want to just read your book, for the audience, because everybody, remember, buy this book, Stalling for Time. It's a fascinating look into, a firsthand account of what negotiations are really like. But can you give us sort of give us the high points of?
Well, I'll give you a few. Obviously, when I was relieved at Waco, I flew to the Middle East for a training operation, which had long been scheduled. And that was part of the excuse to rotate me out. You need to go on this mission. Well, that could have easily been handled by somebody else, but be that as it may. When I come back from the Middle East, immediately upon leaving Waco, I come back from the Middle East and my boss says, hey, one of two things, we're either going to send you back to Waco or we're going to send you to Lucasville, Ohio, where a prison riot's ongoing. He calls me the next day and he says, they're going to put tear gas in, go to FBI headquarters to the command post. So that's where I went. And of course, that's where I was when they put the gas in, and I observed that. I was very angry and I jumped on a plane and flew to the prison riot. So I go from Waco to the Middle East to Lucasville without really almost getting a change of clothes. And but we resolved Lucasville, and that was successful, and helped the local authorities there resolve that peacefully. And and then, as I mentioned, 3 years later, we had the Montana siege. We worked the St. Martinsville prison riot, another Cuban situation. I worked what is one of the other ones? I'm having a old man moment here. Vieques Island was a big case we worked. The Republic of Texas siege in '96. I flew down to Texas and helped the Texas Rangers resolve that situation with another anti-government group. And then, of course, the Montana Freemen. That was also. And then I flew down to Peru in 96, 97 for the.
Oh, the embassy.
Yeah, I flew down for the 120-day long siege in Lima, Peru. So, I get around. I get around.
Gary, what does a negotiator like you see when you walk onto a scene, whether it's like the Freemans or whatever it is, or Peru? What do you see that other people don't see? Like, what are your goals that are different than the tactical operators on the ground?
Well, first of all, I mean, I try to look at what's the best approach to stabilize the situation and to open a channel of communication to the extent we can without jeopardizing security and safety, lower the confrontation. If you're in somebody's face, it's harder to calm them down than if you back off a little bit. So that's the first thing I look at. And then I look at behavior. What are really motivation? Why are they doing what they're doing? What are they trying to accomplish? And then what are their needs? And how do we formulate an approach that helps them realize that, if they have outlandish demands, that it's really not going to work out the way they want. And I just look at a lot of different things, and it's mostly about, is there potential for building a relationship with this person? I don't mean a loving long-term friendship. I'm talking just about a practical engagement where, you're basically saying as a negotiator, hey, listen, man, I don't know if I can help you with all the things you want to accomplish, but I'm here to listen to you, and I want to understand where you're coming from. And if I tell you something, you can count on it. If I make a representation to you, I'm not going to screw around with you. Just basic good human interpersonal communication.
I would love, if you don't mind, to hear a little bit about the Lima embassy siege, because that's something that's kind of been like, I don't want to say swept under the rug or anything, but it's something that happened prior to 9/11, major terrorist incident that like nobody really talks about. If you have any anecdotes or recollections from your time there, I'd be really interested to hear your insight.
Well, I flew down on a U.S. government plane. There was a celebration at the Japanese ambassador's residence home, which was, by the way, built as a model of Tara from Gone with the Wind. A little side note. And it was where the Japanese ambassador lived, and they were holding a party to celebrate the emperor's birthday. And basically every dignitary and bigwig in Lima was there. Ambassadors from dozens of countries, generals, important government officials. President Fujimori's mother and sister were there. So there was just several hundred people in attendance, and the MRTA, not the Shining Path, this is a separate group, the MRTA terrorist organization, conducted this operation where they used explosives and blew into the place and captured everybody. There was probably, I don't know, a dozen of them. I can't remember off the top of my head. And the situation, was pretty tense. There was American diplomats in there, so that's why I flew down with others from the U.S. government to help manage the situation. But what we quickly learned that President Fujimori was trying to snatch the jaws of defeat. He was trying to pull defeat out of victory. I mean, these guys wanted to talk. They put signs out. We want to communicate. We want to communicate. And he refused, thinking it would be a sign of weakness. And he refused to talk with them. And, I'm trying to remind those officials down there, I said, listen, he's got literally hundreds of hostages. They have throwaways. They can kill a whole bunch and not diminish their bargaining position or their defensive positions one iota. Talk to them. Open a dialogue. Well, Fujimori really resisted that. And finally, he'd released a Catholic bishop, a Canadian ambassador, and a few others who became sort of intermediaries that through, it was funny, we had a little ad hoc negotiation team, 2 negotiators from Scotland Yard, 2 from the RCMP, and myself and another FBI negotiator, and I trained all of them. And we huddled together, and we would come up with a consensus, and go back to our ambassadors, and basically give them all the same advice, which they then would pass to these intermediaries. But it was a very complex situation, and President Fujimori just never learned to keep his mouth shut. He constantly said unhelpful and aggressive things for his domestic political consumption that only made the situation more tense and more volatile. But we eventually came up with an idea, and the FBI was doing it, where the garbage would come out of the place, and we'd go through the garbage, and we were finding notes from the hostages telling us what was going on, so forth and so on. And there's some other things like that that happened. So we had a channel of communication, and ultimately, while negotiations was slowly going on with not much success, the Peruvians built a tunnel to try to get access to under the road and to the residents. Now, to mask that tunnel digging, they conducted big military parades every day. And one day, one of the soldiers shot the finger at the rebels, and the rebels fired off a round, almost killed the guy, just missed him by an inch. And that would have set in motion a tragedy for sure. But ultimately, the information that we gathered from the information that was coming out through the trash and so forth was that every day at a certain time, the male terrorists they cleared all the furniture out of the living room, and they were playing soccer indoors. And so we knew exactly what time that took place every day. So the Peruvians put an explosive under the floor and detonated it and killed almost all the hostage takers right there in one explosion.
Holy shit.
Then they rushed the building and killed the rest of them, and released all the hostages. One hostage, I think, died of a heart attack. One commando was killed, and all the terrorists were killed. So it was looked at as a huge success. But from my point of view, and I think I talk about it in the book, by the grace of God, that thing didn't turn to crap, because
Right,
Fujimori had you talk about better being lucky than good. He was lucky in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't, when people are threatening people's lives, you don't just refuse to talk to them. It's not good policy.
How has, you've been with, or you had been with the FBI through, like you said, 30 years, like seeing the genesis of negotiation. How had the training, the art, the science of negotiation, how has it changed through the years?
Yeah, when I first got into it, the New York model was, all due respect to them, was a pretty basic quid pro quo model. Hey, you want a hamburger? Well, you got to let a hostage go, and I'll give you a hamburger. It was basically built on that model. But what we found when I became a full-time negotiator is our examination of what was going on around the country, not just with us, but with police departments, was these weren't really, for the most part, quid pro quo bargainings, which is what a hostage situation is. That's usually quid pro quo. You hold a hostage because you can't get what you want, and you threaten to harm them unless somebody gives you what you want. But 90+% of what cops were doing were emotionally driven situations with no clear purpose, no clear goal, unplanned, people just acting out, not knowing how to get out of what they got into. So I think the biggest innovation in negotiations was when we in the FBI in 1990 wholesale changed our course to incorporate active listening skills that Carl Rogers originated, that we got from the counseling field, mental health field, and we applied those in a way that negotiators could easily learn them, practice them, and master them. So even to this day, say 1990, if I'd gone to a negotiation conference and said, how many of you know what active listening skills are? You're probably lucky if one hand out of 200 people went up. Now every negotiator, it's the bread and butter of what they do. If you haven't been taught active listening skills, you're just simply not a negotiator. It's what we do, and it's about restating the content of what we hear and responding to the emotion we hear. So it's listening to people, trying to understand what's motivating them, giving them an opportunity to get stuff off their chest and to share with us things that are bothering them. They feel a sense of loss over self-esteem, job, family, relationship, you name it. It's a driving motivation, and we may be the most empathic, ear that they've yet to have. People feel like they're not being listened to. They misbehave so that people start paying attention to them. So we're there to say, can you tell me more about that? What happened? You say your boss fired you and you want to kill him. Well, what exactly happened today? Please explain to me. Open-ended questions. We label the emotions we hear, and it's just a very powerful tool to project empathy and to get people to cooperate with us. It's has applicability far beyond negotiations, but it's a great life skill.
When you're in that sort of situation and then people go, okay, I'm being heard, but I've really fucked up. Now I'm going to go to jail for the rest of my life, or this is going to happen. Do you guys find yourselves in positions where you need to stress the truth for people, or are you just generally honest with them? Like, yeah, you messed up. Yeah, this isn't a great situation, but we'll do the best we can to help you.
I mean, that's essentially it. I mean, we avoid to the extent we can lying, but we would basically say like, hey, I'm not going to tell you there's not any consequences to this, but I'm not a judge, I'm not a jury. I can't decide, you and I can't decide here what's going to happen. But I know one thing, hurting those people isn't going to make the situation any better. And, I'll certainly be willing to tell the judge that you were cooperative when we spoke, and, you didn't hurt anybody else after we started talking. And I think that may be of value to you, because a lot of these guys have had a track record with the criminal justice system. If you say, oh, it's no big deal, it's no problem, don't worry about it, they know you're lying to them,
right.
And you've lost all credibility. You just say, I don't know, this is serious. You shot somebody, and, there's going to have to be some investigation of that. But, and it gets tougher when they've actually killed somebody or killed a cop even. You can't very well say, hey, it's no big deal. You've got to play the card that, hey, let's not make it worse.
Right.
And go from there.
Right.
But I think, I think people come out, I'll share with you something I share with other audiences that in all the situations I was involved in where we ask people, what did we say that made you come out? Because we want to know, we want to learn.
Sure.
So we do it again. And the answer is always the same. It's really funny. It's always the same answer, more or less. And it's, I don't remember what you said, but I like the way you said it. And you think about that in terms of not just these situations, but all interpersonal communications. Your tone, your genuineness, your sincerity, your likability, these are all powerful tools we use to get people's respect. People want to work with people they like and respect. And if you gain the respect, and you do that by showing respect to them and treating them fairly and genuinely, I can't guarantee doing that will lead you to success. But I would say that if you are successful, it's probably because you're doing it that way. So, I mean, that's kind of, you asked earlier, that's been the biggest shift in negotiations. And I think, some people think it's all about, well, understanding their mental health and psyching them out and getting inside their brain. And, that all sounds good and it's good for TV. But the bottom line is you just come across as a genuine, helpful person. Non-threatening. And that's worth its weight in gold.
Are there statistics or sort of studies on the outcomes of situations when there is and is not a trained negotiator on scene?
I don't know if it's broken down that way, but I know the FBI has a hostage barricade database, and I think negotiators are successful in the 90%. I mean, it's pretty significant, and so yeah. I mean, if we take our time and we're patient and we're thoughtful, that's usually going to be the pathway to success.
So, given that significance, has the role or the authority, I'll say, the authority of negotiators on scene to actually dictate what happens on scene instead of being overruled by HRT or SWAT or the tactical person in charge, has the negotiator's authority increased due to sort of those statistics?
I wouldn't say authority. I would hopefully say influence.
Okay.
If you're the chief of police and you have a situation that's tense and may not have a happy ending, you certainly want to be able to say, I listened carefully to my negotiators and allowed them the time and support to try to convince this person to come out peacefully. Unfortunately, his behavior left us no choice, and I had to authorize a sniper to take a shot, whatever it might be. But, I think negotiations has to be the default. But we always teach that negotiators negotiate and commanders command. We don't want to be the ultimate decision maker. Now, as a practical matter, when I was in as long as I was, if I made a suggestion at an incident, it was, increasingly difficult for an on-scene commander to say, well, who are you? You don't know what you're talking about. Right. It was sort of a career-threatening position to take at that point in time, but ultimately, as a negotiator, you had to say, boss, this is your decision. You have to decide. Here's what I recommend. Here's what the negotiation team has been working on. This is how we see it. This is the approach we believe we should take. We think it's going to take a while yet, but we'd like to continue doing this. And, if you lay that out carefully and you've got a thoughtful decision maker, then you usually prevail.
As a negotiator, outside of something obvious like them starting to kill hostages or something, as a negotiator, did you sort of had hard limits, or in your mind when you just felt like negotiations had failed and you'd say, hey, we've done everything we can, but we don't feel like it's going to go anywhere?
No, that's not the trigger. I never gave up on negotiations, and I never said they failed. In fact, I think they always succeed, as I mentioned earlier, because they buy time and allows you to assemble resources and better decision making and all that kind of stuff. The only time I would go, and I have done that in real life, gone to a commander is to say, these are indicators of great concern. There's been a shift in behavior, in attitude, in threats made. Our relationship has seemed to have gone down the toilet. It's our concerted view as a negotiation team that this person is becoming less stable, more dangerous, and more volatile. Now, what that basically translates to is now, if the tactical team has a viable plan, you may give that more consideration now than you would have, a little bit earlier. So, and I think that's the proper way. I think negotiation should always be the default. You can't very well say, this tactical plan didn't work, so now we're going to try to talk to you.
Right.
You can go from talk to action, but it's hard to go from action to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. So for everybody out there who's not going to be negotiating for the life of a hostage, what from your learned experience in negotiation can they bring into their life, like with their spouse, with anybody around them? Like, what are some key elements of negotiation that are just great for everyday life?
I think the biggest thing, and as we apply to men in the military and law enforcement particularly, but men more broadly, we're problem solvers. We see a problem, we want to identify it, and then move on to the next problem. So when our spouses are, come up to us with a problem, we're quick to find the pathway to a solution. Okay, well, you tell them this, you do that, boom, 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 boom. And 9 out of 10 times, that's not what they want from us at all. They just want somebody to listen to them and to acknowledge how they feel about a situation. So you have to force yourself. And it took me time. I wasn't good at this automatically. You have to invest the time in listening. And we call it active listening. And I'll tell you why, because listening is not a passive endeavor. If it's a passive endeavor, you don't say anything, you don't do anything, you just sit there. Active listening is asking open-ended questions. Can you tell me more about that? Or labeling emotions. It seems like you were really disappointed when she said that to you. No, I wasn't disappointed. I was surprised. Fine, I've just learned something. I thought I was hearing disappointment, but it was surprise. Well, that's good. He's clarified for me. Now I have a little better understanding of how this person. So you can only get to that point by really focusing in on what they have to say. If I'm talking, I'm not learning anything about them. I want to listen to them, but I have to engage them in a way that encourages them to tell me more and more and more, and to share with me how they're, not just what happened to them in life, but how they feel about it, and how that's driving their motivation. And I'll tell you, if you do that with your spouse, your girlfriend, your significant other, your kids, it makes a hell of a difference. I mean, I've got 7 grandkids now, and my kids are all grown, and they were great. They were super, and I think I was a pretty good dad overall. But I have more time with my grandkids now when they're around, and I appreciate how short-lived that is. That developmental time in their lives when they're young. They're all under age 11. So when they come up to me and they say, "Poppy," they want to talk to me about something. I mean, they get my full undivided attention, and it's the old "Cats in the Cradle" song by Harry Chapin,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I cry almost every time I hear that song because it's so powerful. It's so moving about, that we keep saying, well, I don't have time now. I'll do this later. But the people in our lives who are important to us, close friends, coworkers, spouses, family members, relatives, if you think there's something going on, you need to listen, and really try to understand.
Yeah.
It's the cheapest concession we can make, and it's powerful. People will really appreciate the fact that you're the kind of person that wants to know more about what happened to them and how they feel about it. So that's my primary advice.
I think it's fantastic advice. I mean, look, if you're negotiating for the life of people, or whether it's people being held or just the person you're negotiating with, or the law enforcement going inside, like, it's such a, I don't want to say low risk with family and friends, but to take those lessons and be able to pass them on, it's phenomenal. It's something.
It is, and we all think we're good listeners, and most of us aren't. And it's a skill you have to learn if you want to be effective. And I don't know a single business, a single type of relationship, a single endeavor. Maybe if you live in a lighthouse off the coast of Maine by yourself, you don't need this stuff. But for 99.99999% of the rest of us, we're social animals. We have to deal with other human beings. So if we can become responsive listener and understand others. Well, even Stephen Covey, the business guru, he says, seek first to understand and then to be understood. So make the effort first before you give advice or try to solve somebody's problem. Understand what they're going through. And even in a hostage taking or barricaded situation, the thing I love to hear is when I get to a point where somebody will say, Gary, we've been talking for a while. I just don't know how to get out of this.
Yeah.
Well, that's music to my ears because now I've earned their respect and I've demonstrated genuineness, and now they're asking me for some advice. And that's where you come in and say, well, I think the best thing to do is put that gun down. And I think there's some tough issues to overcome, but you got your whole life ahead of you. Let's get you some help. Let's work through this, because I've finally, through listening, I've earned the right to be of influence. It doesn't just come to you because of your rank or your status, or you have to earn it.
With these, sort of bonds you've created with these people in these barricaded or hostage situations, have they ever reached out to you afterwards because they felt a kinship with you? And how did you respond to that if they did?
More so with hostages than hostage takers. I know there was one of the fellows from the Montana siege that, to end the siege, we developed quite a good personal relationship. And he and I have been in contact subsequently, and we're friends on Facebook, and I have a lot of respect for him. I didn't agree with some of the decisions he made, but he was inherently a good person, and I liked him. I like him to this day. And, and I think you need to find the good in people, and most people have some good in them, and, let that be your goal.
It's amazing. So Gary, thank you so much for spending your evening with us here on a Monday.
Sure.
Stalling for time, buy this book. Gary, where else can people find you?
Well, I have a website, GaryNoesner.com, all one word, and it's got articles I've written and news interviews and podcast links and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, so that's the best place.
Yeah. So yeah, check out the book, and like I said, check out American Apocalypse on Netflix with Gary's one of the people interviewed in it. I think you guys out there will really enjoy it.
And you might, and
maybe
might
enjoy is the wrong word, but I mean it's illuminating. It's an important piece.
And they may want to look at the Showtime Paramount Waco, the Aftermath dramatic series. They've shown 3 of them. They have 2 more to go every Friday night, and that's with actor Michael Shannon playing me again, who's really a pretty amazing individual.
And are you still teaching negotiation?
Not really. I give some. I'm doing this television consulting, and then I do some corporate speaking, occasional law enforcement conference. But in terms of teaching a long class, I don't do that anymore. I'm mostly retired and enjoying life, playing golf and boating and all that sort of good stuff.
We have 2 questions here, and I don't know if we have any on Patreon, but Danny, thank you very much. Does Gary believe that the artificial intelligence will influence or be incorporated in hostage negotiations in the future?
I'm going to have to plead ignorance here. I haven't followed the AI stories much lately, and I don't know a lot about it, not enough to speak to it. But from what I do know, I wouldn't be surprised if it plays some role at some point in time.
And also from Danny, thank you very much again. Did Gary retire before the Clive and Amon Bundy standoff in Oregon 2016? Any thoughts on that standoff and its eventual resolution?
Yeah, I did retire before that. I retired in 2003. The Bundy siege, you're talking about the one in Oregon. I think there was been a couple of actions with the Bundys, but the one in Oregon, I think the FBI took a very patient and thoughtful approach to dealing with that, and fortunately got resolved peacefully. So, obviously, lessons learned.
Yeah.
So, folks out there listening, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Check us out on Patreon. The link's below if you want to get these episodes ad-free. And we'll be back on Friday with Gary Linderer, who served as a LORP in Vietnam. Really excited to have him on the show. And Gary, thank you again for coming and telling us about your experiences and your memoir.
Buy the book. You'll love it. Stalling for Time. I can't tell you how fascinating it is.
Well, thanks, guys. It was a pleasure.
Also how frustrating you must have felt at certain points in time.
I deal with frustration pretty well. So, yes.
Gary, thank you so much for your time. We deeply, deeply appreciate it.
You're welcome, guys. The pleasure was all mine.
All right. Take care, everyone. We'll see you Friday.